Hey everyone, nothing happened. It's May 18th. Welcome to the weekly JupyterLab call. Please find the link to the agenda in the chat. And today we have 17 people on the call. That's pretty good. So why don't we get started? The first person on the agenda is Eric, but he says he can't join the meeting. And it says he plans to cut a JupyterLab 3.4.1 patch release tomorrow to release the latest merged fixes.
You're looking at last week's, Darian. Scroll
Oh
up.
my. Oh my.
You're good. That patch release was a failure, and we had to put out another one the next day.
Well, thanks for the update. Good save. All right, Isabella, you are up. But you're still typing.
I mean, it's because we lost part of it in the thing that didn't happen.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, my usual announcements. JupyterLab accessibility call will be 15 minutes after this one. All are welcome. I do have some updates on current work. I'm expecting that we'll talk a little bit about the automated testing stuff that's been happening at the Jupyter accessibility repo. So if that interests you at all, I'd love to have that discussion with you. And then a few weeks ago, I was asked, what's happening with the Jupyter community call rescheduling stuff? For May, I just decided on the time because it was approaching. So that is now on the calendar. It will be May 31st, which I've been informed for many people in the US who actually take holidays, read not me, that is a day people will be out. So sorry about that, but I didn't really see a better time without moving stuff weird. So that'll happen, and it'll be at a totally different time in June. We're going to experiment with some different times to rotate through, is my current plan, to see if there's a better time for different time zones, since that was the popular request, was can we alternate times, kind of like the Jupyter Hub meeting does. So that's your community call update. Hope to see some of y'all at the next few calls. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, cool, thanks.
Cool. Thank you for hosting that call. Jason W.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? All right. Yes. JupyterLab comments. We talked a little bit about this last week. There's a JupyterLab Team Compass issue 145 to talk about moving the comments repo from the Cal Poly project to the JupyterLab project. This was a former intern project that I have working, with all due respect, I have it working in, I would say, bug for bug compatible way. Although I'm still working on like getting toolbar support to work. I appreciate Frederick gave me some good feedback on that, which I have not yet actually incorporated yet into that. So I'm not quite ready to merge this in, but Brian has asked that we call for a vote on actually kind of considering and accepting that idea. And if anyone has any questions about doing this, I'd be happy to take them either here or in the context of that issue or separately.
So to be clear, at one point you had a work in progress to bring that repo directly into core, but instead the plan is to first bring in that repo into the JupyterLab org as a standalone extension, then at some future date to bring that into core. Is that right?
I mean, the PR is to bring it into core directly. We may need to, let me just pull up the Team Compass issue. So there's two aspects to this. One is to get rid of the old commenting repo, which hasn't been modified in over 2 years. To pull in JupyterLab comments into the JupyterLab project space, which that's not what my PR does. My PR kind of jumps straight to number 3, which is incorporating JupyterLab comments extensions into the main JupyterLab repository. So whether or not comments remains as a separate thing for the long term, I think is kind of secondary. Like we're probably going to get rid of it in time anyway if there's value in having it in core.
Isabel?
I just wanted to check. I saw Brian's comment about like vote, but I thought it was a question. And so that made me unsure if we were voting or not. But I think that brings up a bigger question of, is there some kind of statement or change that makes us know when we're going into a vote versus not? So both a question of, I wasn't sure the status of this particular issue, and then is there something I'm missing for issues in general?
Yeah, is Brian on this call? I
So-
don't want to
think
talk
so.
over him. No, he's
I
not.
think I can answer this. So basically, we have two labels in the team compass. One is vote and one is decision made. And so if a member of the JupyterLab Council proposes putting something to a vote, we can do that. In general, we already have a policy of when bringing in a new repo into the JupyterLab org from outside the JupyterLab org, we would have had to have done a vote. So this is just like, if it turns out that the next step is bring JupyterLab comments from Jupyter Cal Poly into JupyterLab, then we write one individual issue on the team compass, that's a vote, lists everyone there, and you can either vote yes or no or abstain if you're one of the members of the JupyterLab Council. I think at this point, because the council is large enough and its constituents are like listed publicly, even though it's a draft PR, it's still there. I think we could probably do that. We've already done one vote for Frederick's proposal to do fast UI elements. So yeah, so that's the approximate answer to that. I know there's probably more to talk about, but Alex also had his hand up. So
Yeah, my question is, if for this proposed solution, if we're doing step 3, is there any purpose in also doing step 2? Because if we're going to be putting it into core, why would we move this repo into the JupyterLab org if we're just going to immediately archive it and put it in core?
I don't think we're going to immediately archive it. So the extension is at a state where it's not production ready, and it's not something that we would want to graft directly into a JupyterLab branch that's headed toward production. Instead, we work on it as a third-party extension that is in the JupyterLab org until it's ready. And once it is ready for publication, then we can bring it into JupyterLab core.
Okay, because there's an issue on core for actually moving it into core. I mean, sorry, there's an open PR that's work in progress for actually moving it into core, which was where I think my confusion.
That is true, Alex, but as the author of that PR, I would encourage you to try it out because it is very much a work in progress. I don't think it's quite professional. I don't think it's quite production ready yet. I see William's got his hand up.
I'm curious what the status is of the spec in terms of how the IPyNB markdown, I mean, the IPyNB JSON file is configured. Like, how do you represent comments in that file?
So right now, the storage mechanism is unchanged from the Cal Poly work, which is to say that it uses what I'm going to call a sidecar file, which means that all of the comments for a file X are in like an x.comments file, which means that when you want to transmit the X notebook, you have to transmit 2 files. Otherwise, without the sidecar, the notebook appears without comments at all.
Is this something you like? Because that really surprises me a lot. I thought that like step 1 of this whole thing was to come up with a way of putting comments in the IPyNB file. I'm just a little surprised.
Well, we talked about this before, and
okay.
and I respect the thumbs down emoji I'm getting. I always like getting heckled in emoji form. But the issue, so I asked about this, why can't we just incorporate the comments into one file rather than having this sidecar format? And the answer I got was that the comments extension is intended to work for text files and metadata files that don't have metadata included in the file. Like if you have a markdown file, the comments would have to just modify the content of the markdown, which is not suitable. And so the sidecar format is the least worst option in this case. Now, that doesn't negate your complaint about like IPyNB files can have metadata. There's a larger question of like, if you open an IPy notebook file with a third-party Jupyter client such as VS Code that doesn't understand our comments or has implemented comments in a different way, it could inadvertently destroy that metadata. That's also a concern.
So my interest is, of course, writing a third-party Jupyter client that does play well with whatever comment system you do. So I want to, and also encouraging VS Code and Colab and so on to play well as well.
Yep.
So that's my personal views.
No, that's
why I'm
a
paying
valid
attention to this.
that's a
I
valid
want that to
concern,
work.
and I think honestly, like moving the comments extension into core will elevate the discussion to say, like, we are working on a core, like, open source definition of what comments are, as opposed to leaving it up to every author to come up with their own definition of it. I'm optimistic that we can at least create a standard and promulgate it and hold people to it. Call me naive, but I think that's better than just kind of leaving it up to every author.
Well, I'm very
So-
happy to try to implement whatever standard you guys do, so, and encourage others to do so as well.
There's no reason why we couldn't, in the format that we do publish and draft and control, to have known metadata keys. And the point of metadata is for any sort of extension to use it. And we just imagine people play nice with each other. They don't just say, no, delete everything in metadata. They assume they don't own that whole key. And so I think, sure, maybe as a last resort for files where we don't know how to author the comments inline, we have these sidecar files. But it seems, at least for the notebook format, a format that Jupyter controls, that Jupyter defined, and that Jupyter put a place in for metadata, which to me, commentary is the epitome of metadata, right? It's like aftermarket humans have put their eyes on this thing and put their opinions down on it. And like, that's metadata. So like, if we have a way of doing that with notebooks, but not a way of doing that with text files, then maybe we should do it with notebooks, but not with text files, instead of doing it with neither, just to get lowest common denominator.
I mean,
Okay.
I would appreciate just a quick proposal about how that might look, because it's pretty high on my priority list to have commenting that's in the IPyNB file, just because, you know, people grading homework that's written as a Jupyter notebook would really benefit immensely from this. I mean, I bet that's what motivated the original work. And then like having two different files just increases the chances for problems. So even I'd hate to be the person that has to come up with the spec that's in the IPyNB file, and then I don't have the experience that you have having re-implemented this extension.
So I think there's two steps then that we can take from this. One is a standalone Team Compass vote on bringing that repo into the JupyterLab org and voting on it. And two is either that vote fails and it remains in Jupyter Cal Poly and we find some other way of shipping it, or that vote passes, in which case, once it's here, we open an issue there that says, let's decide the format, and we discuss that, implemented as presumably some JSON schema that's aftermarket applied to just the metadata key of the NB format, so that it's not like a change to the NB format itself or something. I don't know. We have that conversation in that issue. Anyone else?
For what it's worth, we included it in the 4.0 roadmap of JupyterLab.
Yeah. JupyterLab forever. That's what I'm calling it.
I'm gonna steal that from you, Darian. That's
Right.
what it feels like.
Yeah, well, we're adding a lot to it, aren't we? So, all right. Other people haven't added to the agenda aside from the additional discussions, but I imagine there might be people who have things to discuss. Is there anyone who potentially would have put something on the agenda, did not, and now has changed their mind?
I can clarify that statement I made right as we started. There is a release of 3.4.2 that went out at the very end of last week that addressed a bug that got released in 3.4.1, and also caught 2 or 3 PRs that got backported literally an hour after 3.4.1 got released. So that is out as of last Friday. And this time there's no problems with it that have been reported. Also, I apologize. It was my PR that was the problem.
Well, thanks for fixing it quickly. Okay, so there's 3 PRs needing review in the list here. Could you please take a look and see if you feel comfortable reviewing any of them and assign yourself as a reviewer? That's a start for how to get these things reviewed, I think. And another thing, I guess, is if you have a PR open that needs review, maybe add it to this list. And that way we can solicit the help of 18 people. Because I'll tell you what, it's Fred and David right now, and they're getting the eyes. So maybe you want to get some eyes on your work, eh?
Well, and they do always review everyone else's, it feels like.
And to be fair, I took over the PR of David, so it's mainly my work. It's his name, but it's my work.
All right.
That one is maybe a bit tricky because it's about Node.js package stuff and the ASM module. But
Oh yes, this one, right. Cool. Really, no one else has a PR they want to have reviewed? All right. So I guess we can talk about the additional discussion for now. And if somebody wants to raise a different thing, that's cool too. Although I do notice Steve is on the call, and maybe he wants to talk about Hatch if it's not premature in this call. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's good timing. So I already gave this brief to the folks that were in the notebook call, so apologies to people that are attending both. But so there's an open PR notebook that basically swaps out our use of Jupyter packaging and setup tools for Hatch and a plugin I made for Hatch called Hatch Jupyter Builder. What Hatch is it's a new project. Well, it's an existing project that was recently moved under the Python Packaging Authority, so it's in that org. And what it does is it's a modernized build backend provider where Flit is Pip. I'm sorry, is a front end, and Flit was an example of another backend and setup tool. So it's in the same kind of place as Flit and setup tools as far as Jupyter packaging, Python packaging, and but the advantage it gives us over setup tools is that it meets all the modern PEP standards, including editable wheel support, and it's got hooks so you can do like pre-build steps for things, and you can make plugins, which is what Hatch Jupyter Builder is. And it's a nice clean code base. It just reached 1.0 for both the backend code and the Hatch. So Hatchling is the backend package, and Hatch is like the command line utility for doing more advanced things. So what that PR notebook does is it takes gets rid of setup.config, setup.py, and instead you have more entries in pyproject.toml to use Hatch and the Hatch Jupyter Builder. And what's in Hatch Jupyter Builder is what used to be in Jupyter Packaging, the npm builder function that you can declare what things, the metadata for that's currently already in Notebook and Lab are both using that metadata, similar metadata. So just you convert that to use the Hatch Jupyter Builder instead, and there's an additional option for the editable build command. So you can have separate commands for when you're making an Estes for wheel versus the editable wheel, which is the pip install.e command. And so you could do like just a build regular versus build prod for those two different targets. And so it's completely declarative. There's no more setup.py. So there's no more runtime code for packaging in your repo if you switch to this. So all the runtime pieces are in Hatch and Hatch Jupyter Builder. So I've already actually across the board from a lot of repos. I had tried to use Flit, but then Pip came out with a release last week that broke all of our uses of flit, which is really annoying. There's a patch that we're waiting for from pip that fixes that. But I was so impressed with Hatch from trying to use it for these other things that I tried it, and basically across the board, everywhere we were using flit a couple weeks ago, we're now immediately switching over to Hatch. And that includes like the most complex one of that is ipykernel, which has a build step to produce the JIT, the kernel spec files. And it also produces, so those are data files that get put into shared Jupyter. And then there's also two top-level entities for that. There's the ipykernel package and ipykernel launcher.py that both get put into setup tools or site packages. And you can't do that with flit. So that's the reason I hadn't converted that one to flit yet, but you can do that with Hatch. Hatch is like Swiss Army knife. You can do whatever you want with it. And the Hatch author, it was under their org. Now it's under PyPA, but they're still primarily the one working on it. Has been very responsive and actually commenting on my PRs and offering help. They had a bug fix for something I ran into. So been very impressed with that interaction. So yeah, so the outcome is there's a proof of concept that gets working on Notebook with the Hatch builder. And then the intent was to use that for things like the cookie cutter extension, where we're currently using set.py and Jupyter packaging, JupyterLab itself. Basically anywhere we're using Jupyter packaging, we could swap this thing out. So I was going to post to the Team Compass issue, suggested moving my org, my repo, Blink1073 / Jupyter Hatch Jupyter Builder into the JupyterLab org, so that can be under Jupyter governance and maintained there. And then we start swapping out our use of Jupyter packaging for that thing. And that's it.
Cool, thanks, Steve. I added a link to that PR from Notebook to the agenda in case anyone's curious to track it. Any comments, questions? Okay. So yesterday we had a call on the calendar for this additional discussion point, which is upgrading a code mirror from 5 to 6, what it takes, what the API differences are, and a sort of description of the draft PR that Johan has opened. So Johan did a run through of the differences and the API concepts of CodeMirror 6. And someone added this as an additional discussion item. So for reference, that link is to yesterday's meeting in case you're curious. But who added the discussion item and what would you like to discuss about it?
It was just me for awareness mostly. And since we also discussed the timeline and like when we could get this thing merged into core and released in a pre-release somewhere sometime, because this is quite of a significant change and the extensions will need to be updated, so we need to give time to people to do that. That was just to bring that up. That's it.
Let's link the PR as well. So here it is, I think. Yeah, so I'm going to paste this in the agenda so everyone can see it. I guess it's currently in draft mode. I wonder how far Johan is from finding it ready. And I guess also that rebase is probably just going to remain painful no matter what, because it touches such a low level concept. Yeah, I don't know. This is a big change. It brings with it a lot of benefits. It isn't it's something we've talked about for a long time, but we've also talked about other editors, and presumably some due diligence has been done here. And I guess I want to solicit any comments or questions people on the call have who may not have thought about this much before or missed yesterday's meeting, but are curious. The video itself is probably, I mean, it was an hour-long call. We recorded most of it, and Johan did make a slide deck to talk through some of it. So it's actually worth your while if you're curious in this. But is anyone on the call now who has any commentary on this? Oh, I don't know if Johan shared the slides. That's a really great point. We should ask him, and if he has, I'll update the YouTube link to have a link to them as well. Right now, I believe the content of the slides is contained only within the video in an accessible way for now, but hopefully he still has them and he can link to them.
I think just calling out one of the discussions from that meeting was looking for a lot of different people to review it kind of with different perspectives and expertise, just because it's such a big PR. So I'm extending that call. Like, I know we had a discussion like, okay, this person should look at how it interacts with JupyterLab LSP. Isabella's going to try and look at it for accessibility stuff. So if there's any area that you feel confident about, I think I'm going to extend that call, because it is, I mean, it's a massive change at like the very core of how everything works.
Yeah, so basically the text editor and the metadata editor and the advanced setting editor JSON blob. Wait, is that still even in existence, or is it all just the visual one now?
No, both exist.
Okay, yes, so that one, the input area of the code console, and of course, all notebook cells are code mirror instances. There's probably others throughout JupyterLab. And so, and the debugger makes heavy use of that. LSP outside of JupyterLab makes heavy use of that. The LSP code that's open in draft PRs makes heavy use of it. So there's a lot of angles and places where code mirrors are being instantiated, usually not by themselves, they're usually being instantiated in an abstracted form. But yeah, the more eyes we can get on it, the better. It's still in the draft mode, so it's not looking for review for merging or anything, but A, it's a good time in this life cycle to familiarize yourself with it if you work on any of those things and care about this. And B, you know, if you do end up wanting to do a review for merging, having had some preparation is probably good because it's big. How many? Yeah, so it's 7,232 additions, 4,512 subtractions, over 51 files. So yeah, more, please more. Okay, well, let's see. There's nothing else on the additional discussions. Oh, you know what? I'm not gonna add this PR needing review to the list because I feel like we have PRs that are actually ready to be merged and not drafts. So is there anything anyone else would like to talk about? We can end the call early if not.
I just took a look at that old roadmap Kanban board. Looks like there's some things in limbo if we wanted to take a look at it.
Sure, do you want to share?
Sure, yeah.
Thanks.
Relatedly, how close are we getting to actually nailing down a timeline for 4.0? Or is there none? Because it feels like we're still far away from even nailing down a timeline. Or do we at least have a set of issues where, like, when these are ready, then we can nail down a timeline?
I'll let somebody else answer before I do.
The point we brought earlier about code mirror, I think, is going to have some influence on that on the timeline for sure. So I think it's still about landing those API breaking changes first, and then giving some time to people to update their extensions. Before, I think, being able to at least make a beta or RC. So it still really depends on this. And I believe there is a list of such changes in the JupyterLab 4.0 issue.
So I think the idea of a good outcome from earlier attempts at a timeline were to have either a final or an RC for SciPy. I think having an RC in the week of July 11 to 17 doesn't seem crazy. It just seems ambitious because that's 2 months from today. Like the 2 months minus 1 week, right? And so I can imagine having a release candidate out by then, but I could also imagine us slipping past that kind of a lot, actually. It's unclear.
Yeah.
Like it's very open-ended.
Because we did have a talk submitted to SciPy to announce 4.0, and it got tentatively accepted as a poster. So it's not a big deal if that just turns into a what's coming soon.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
it is something that at least planning for that talk wise, Martha, Jason, and I will kind of want to know what the big features are when planning that. So it'd be nice to at least nail down the blockers, I guess you could say, like which major features are the reason that we're not cutting this already. So like, for instance, code mirror, notebook 7, I know is another, like being ready to support notebook 7 is another big one. Like what major features are the reasons that we're not just moving forward now?
Right.
Which you could probably indirectly derive from what's currently on screen.
Out of my head, I wrote 3 of them. So there is Code Mirror 6. There is the rework of document for RTC. So that's Carlos that's doing that work. The idea is to have only one container for the data model, and that will be the shared model. So basically we will drop model DB. So that will have an impact quite important on the API. So that's one work in progress, not yet finished. And the other one is one I'm hopefully gonna finish by the end of this month, is proposing a windowing of the notebook, even if I will advise to have it turned off by default. It will still be changing the API because you will have to deal with elements that may not be available right away, even when the notebook is loaded. I mean, some cells may not be fully loaded. So that may impact a third-party extension, like, I don't know, or LSP will be impacted, for example, to not have all the editors available right away or stuff like that. So yeah, that's the main one I'm seeing right now that I can remember.
I mean, we were just talking about commenting. We were talking about in the past, I brought up notifications. There's a bunch of stuff that we want that is 4.x, but I can imagine just saying, okay, this feature makes it into 4.1 instead or something. So yeah, okay, Lane, what do you, how do we use what's on the screen?
Yeah. So we already talked. We already talked about comments. Seems like we already talked about code mirror. This is an old one. And I was wondering, does it still make sense to have this on the roadmap, the virtual windows that Eric was working on?
You're right, Lane. I should replace it by my PR. Yeah, I'll do that if you want.
I'll make a note there. And then, I mean, one thing to notice is I feel like this exercise was useful because so much has been merged from it, 14 issues. And then over here on the left, there was one chunk that looked like it could use a little discussion, was this concept of responsive design and rationalizing the front end. Is that something that's even still being worked on, or should that work be dropped?
That is resolved. I'll update that link. Basically, we figured it out. We were trying to figure out, what do you do with JupyterLab, Jupyter Notebook, NB Classic, RetroLab, and all the different ways people are consuming notebooks using Jupyter UIs. And now we have that answer, right? JupyterLab 4 and Notebook 7 with an end-of-life Notebook 6.5 branch and a supported ongoing for at least one version behind NB Classic 1.0 that will track notebooks development. So when Notebook 8 comes out, maybe NB Classic is phased out. But that discussion has, I think, in the course of the past year, been resolved.
With 4.0, did we want to have a tutorial the first time you launched Jupyter? I think JupyterLab, I think that's what this one was about.
I think Fred maybe has some thoughts on this. Yeah, I'm gonna open a PR to merge the one that the extension Mike is mentioning in the first reply, the JupyterLab tour.
So this is like a tutorial when you first open a new instance of JupyterLab?
Actually, you can define. So there is one that is proposed when you open JupyterLab, but you can add new one, replace that one, or trigger. There is another one that's triggered.
Okay, so this is essentially
a notebook.
Customizable, that if you have it like installed, it will trigger it and you can tell it to do a different one. So if a third party extension wants to replace it, they can, or if they want to just turn it off, they can.
Yeah. Okay. You can even define a tour from the settings if you don't have very advanced things to do. And I think, if I remember correctly, Nick has even extended it so that you can load a tour from metadata in the notebook. Can be funny.
I don't really know where this one came from. I thought it was going to be related to the tutorial, but it's not. And it's from this year, at least.
This is also resolved at this point. We does have an answer. Can you please assign this issue and that other one to me so I can update them with the... Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. And then was it the it was the rationalized one? Okay.
Rationalized one, yeah.
And then I guess the other one is like, I didn't want people to think like when we set out for this was kind of like ideas of what we could get into like V4 eventually. I don't know if it was specifically to cut a release. So there are still some ideas here on the left that have been pretty heavily debated, validated. There's data backing a lot of them. So if people are looking for things to, pick up and run with, like this one was the number one.
Yeah, I think that one is probably a 4.x, not a 4.0, but CRDT is going to give us the ability to basically build that feature, but it won't land on day one, for 4.0 rather. The other one, the next one, the Python package manager one, we were having some conversation about this recently. Yeah, I don't know. Basically, the current extension manager, it is built with the NPM packages as its extensions, but if we switch to the Python ones, we get a bunch of benefits, but what we don't yet have is the ability to install a Python JupyterLab extension that has a backend as well and hot plug it. We can hot plug front end extensions, but not backend ones yet. And I don't know, is anyone thinking or working on this? Do we make this a 4.0 requirement, or is this a 4.x requirement? Who has thoughts? Yeah,
So
Fred.
what I hope to find time, no promise for 4.0, is to rework the current extension manager to be backed by pip by default and not npm. So that, but the focus is definitely for extension of JupyterLab, because I'm not sure that issue is referring to extension for JupyterLab or a more generic package manager, like also to be able to deal with environment or add things in the kernel. So that will be definitely out of my target. And yeah, that if we want to do that, it's probably gonna tough to figure out what's the best thing to do, because a generic package manager handling heavily depends on the kind of technology the user is using for environment and stuff like that. So,
because if you start showing installed packages, you're basically half the way to creating Conda.
Well, I mean, I think that's overstating it. All we really want is to be like Sublime Text or like VS Code or like TextMate or like any other IDE that lets you install extensions in the UI. It's just that because we're web-based, we have harder constraints, and because of the way we have two different language environments, we have constraints. But I think like one day this becomes possible where you are inside JupyterLab, you pop up a list of extensions with little metadata around them, and you know which ones are published by Jupyter and which ones are published by third parties, and you know how to install it by hitting a button and waiting a few seconds and getting it. We're just like the steps from here to there are not obvious yet.
Wouldn't, if we wanted a backend extension to be able to essentially be live added, wouldn't that be a requirement on Jupyter Server though? The ability to add an extension to Jupyter Server without restarting the Jupyter Server. Wouldn't that be like the base requirement for that functionality?
Yeah, probably, unless we just say part of the extension's job is to launch some sort of third-party thing that actually restarts your browser, your server or something. But that seems like a bad move. There might be important stuff happening on the server that might not be an option. So probably the answer is, yeah, the server needs to support that.
Do we have an issue like that open on Jupyter Server asking to add that? Because if that's a feature we want, we probably tell them that's a feature we want. Because I know there's a lot of overlap with the developers, but there's also some not overlap.
Sure. Is anyone from the Jupyter Server project knowledgeable on this?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
How do you do hot plugging on the server? Is that on the roadmap for server?
There is a setting to make Tornado auto reload, but that's not the same as saying I want to load a new thing. I don't know that we have that issue open for like discovering server exceptions at runtime. and loading and registering them.
Is that a thing? Like what's the order of magnitude of difficulty? Is that a thing we can request for server 1.0, or is that probably later?
Well, I mean, that would be a periodic tornado callback that is scanning for server extensions and installing them. So, I mean, there's not much code to that, but I think we want to think through the ramifications and make it an opt-in setting, maybe.
Yeah, because the trouble also is that if we start to support that features, we will need to deal with updating a package. So that means probably removing handlers that are existing because they're gonna be removed. So yeah, and also if two extensions are using the same route dynamically, but I mean, we still have the same trouble even if it's not dynamic. So maybe that one is not such a big issue.
It seems unlikely that we solve the server issues in time to also rewrite the front end JupyterLab extension manager to switch to using pip and release it in time for 4.0. Jason wants to know about Fast API. So I think the current status is there's a fully compatible, ready to go Fast API based Jupyter server, but it's far from being a thing we can ship as the default because of the requirement that you re-author your extension, your server extension. We're not looking to write a shim, we're not looking to write a translation layer, and we're giving up both Traitlets and Tornado, I think. So there's like a configuration cost and an extension cost that's high enough that I think it would be a longer term transition. I'm practically a novice on this, though. Anyone else who knows about this probably has more insight than I do.
No, that sounds right.
Are there people actively working on the Fast API server?
Yeah, David, is he still on a call? He's been working on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. So Jupyverse is in the Jupyter server org. We are shipping it. It's just not something we can make the default Jupyter server implementation because of how much pre-existing configuration and extension code exists.
Is the plan to eventually replace the Jupyter server or offer an alternative that we eventually switch to if it works out well? Or
We haven't, so I am on the Jupyter Server Council. We haven't made an official decision like that. The only official decision we made was let's have this alternate Fast API implementation be part of the Jupyter Server org, and let's support it and work on it, because at some future date, we think Tornado is not going to be tenable. So we need a plan, but we haven't gone farther than that in decision making.
Yeah, so I think there's still work that David had planned to do to make it so that you could swap out the server that JupyterLab uses. And then we'd be able to, to test it in certain deployments and then get more feedback on it that way.
And the change from Tornado handlers to Fast API is probably pretty easy for most use cases and most extensions, but it's not free. Someone has to do it.
Yeah, if you're using anything that's on the Tornado web application object, there wouldn't be an analog to that. And but we could go down the road of shimming things, but then where do you draw the line of what's in the shim? So it's a tough balance.
if the Fast API server helps us with this extension reloading issue?
Oh, I bet it does. I bet Fast API supports that. Let's see.
I don't know.
I'm just going to say yes, uninformed on a recorded call. That sounded funnier in my head.
I was thinking you were signing up to submit the PR to Fast API if it doesn't?
I don't know if Fast API supports it, actually. Okay, I propose we stop recording the call and see if anyone wants to say anything outside of the recording. So brace yourselves.